Hi, welcome. I'm so glad everybody's here to join us. I'm Robin Lipsky. I'm the Executive Director of the 9th Judicial Circuit Historical Society. Say that 3 times fast, I defy you. NJCHS for short. And we're very happy to have you all here.
And good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gareth Evans. I'm the immediate past chair of the board of the NJCHS.
And our current chair, Rita Hausler, unfortunately cannot be with us here today because she's in trial.
Which goes to show that a woman's place really is in the courtroom, right? Right? I mean, look around you, obviously.
And in the boardroom.
And in the C-suite and in the corner office of law firms.
So for those of you who aren't familiar with our organization, our mission is to preserve and educate about the vibrant legal history of the West, and also more generally about the importance of an independent judiciary. Today's program is part of a series of programs that we've put on in recent years regarding issues of contemporary significance that have their genesis here in the 9th Circuit.
And last year, we created an exhibit and organized a number of programs regarding Executive Order 9066, which led to the incarceration of American citizens and immigrants of Japanese descent during World War II. That exhibit is still traveling around the circuit, but you can see it on our website, njchs.org. And if you would like to show that exhibit at your company or at your law firm, you can contact Robin, whose contact information is available on the website.
Thank you. That's great. And this year we're very excited to share our new exhibit, which is on equal protection in education. The exhibit, you might have passed it on your way in. It's out in the hallway. We hope that you'll have a moment to take a look at it after the event. And it's also available for viewing on our website if you don't have time to look at it now.
And we plan to have many more topical programs in the future. We'd like to keep you informed about our activities and our events. And we hope that when you signed in today, you marked on the right column by your name that you're interested in a free 1-year membership in the Historical Society. And if you did not do so and you enjoy this program, we're having all of the sign-in sheets brought up to the reception area, which is going to be outside of the courtroom here. And we encourage you to mark that column by your name with an X or a yes, either during the reception or on your way out.
And we would like to thank the law firm of Morrison & Forster for very graciously sponsoring our lovely reception, which we hope you'll all be able to stay for afterwards. And now I'd like to briefly introduce our panel moderator and our panelists, who will actually be introducing themselves more during the program. Our moderator today is Barbara Babcock, Professor Emeritus of Stanford Law School. Also joining her with us is Honorable Marsha Berzon of the 9th Circuit Court of Appeal, Judge Marilyn Hall Patel, formerly of the Northern District of California, Melinda Hagg of Orrick Law Firm and formerly the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of California, and Dorian Daley, who's General Counsel of Oracle. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Barbara. Thank you.
Well, folks, you're here looking at a vanishing breed, the first women. There soon are going to be meetings where there are no first women to be had. So we all need to kind of enjoy this first woman moment. So I thought that rather than having somebody give an introduction to each of us and how we got to be first, we would explain ourselves, where we came from, and how we joined what has now turned into a vanishing breed. And we'll keep going around the table. A former student of mine, Doris Cordell, who was a judge herself in Santa Clara County, said, "Why do white people just get together and talk one after the other? Why don't you do something more interesting?" And she came up with this idea. And I've done it now a number of times, and it's more interesting than you might think. So just hold on, and I'll tell you how it is that I became a lawyer. My dad was a lawyer, and he was from a a little town in the White Mountains of Arkansas. And he came up during the Depression to Washington, D.C., because you couldn't make a living in Arkansas doing anything. And he became a lawyer. And it was fascinating to me because I would listen to him on the telephone, and he would he would be telling the client what to do or why he couldn't do it. And then at the end of the day, at the dinner table, he would say, "Well, Barb," there were other people at the table, but he always addressed me. "Well, Barb, a lady came into the office today." And then he would tell this terrible thing that had happened to this woman. And then that would be followed by how the lawyer had saved the day with the lawyer's special powers. And I became convinced at about the age of 8 or 9 that I too had such powers and would be able to save people and would be a lawyer. And I set out on that path, and I'll tell you more about it later. I'll turn it over to Marilyn.
Well, I did not have a father who was a lawyer, but I would say that he certainly was my inspiration. I think maybe I was the son he never had, and I was the oldest daughter. Actually, they'd had a son who died at birth before I was born, so maybe I really was the son he never had. And I was a sidekick, and I never thought at any time that there wasn't something I couldn't do. For some reason, I sort of fixed on being a lawyer. I think I saw those movies, with, Hepburn, and she's in a suit and she's got a briefcase. And that appealed to me. I had no idea what lawyers did. At that time, they also had these things called Cooter preference tests. You even took them in grade school, I think, and then you took them in high school. And they told you what, your proclivities might be or what you might, showed interest in or whatever. And I always came out high on the lawyer side. So when it came time to go to college, and I have to tell you something about my father. His father died when he was quite young, and he ended up having to drop out of school and having to work. He never graduated from high school even. Education to him was very important. And there was never any doubt in my mind through my whole childhood and growing up that I wouldn't go to college. Now, he wasn't particularly fond of lawyers, however. So his idea for me is that an engineer, or are you ready for this, a minister. But hey, that wasn't an engineer's wife, it wasn't a minister's wife. And I still set him on my sights on being a lawyer. He thought somehow, I guess if I became a lawyer, well, not so good. But if I could come back upstate New York, which is where I was raised in Mohawk Valley, that there'd never been a woman judge up there. Maybe I could become a judge. I don't think he realized how long you have to be a lawyer before you become a judge. But I didn't have to wait that long, actually. And unfortunately, he passed away, so we never saw that. But I did become a judge in California, and I've never looked back. I've been very, very fortunate in my life to have followed that desire, and actually I hadn't been out of law school all that long when I did become a judge, so I said I'm very, very fortunate, and that's what I think. Once you set your mind to something, and you have a goal, you really have to work at it and work hard at it, but try to fulfill it. I think you want to tell us how you got to where you are and all the rest on the way?
Sure. So I became a lawyer after I had made the very firm and adamant decision to never go to law school. Like Judge Patel, I had grown up in a family that was very supportive. It was never occurred to me that I would not go on to college and go on to graduate school of some sort. I had older brothers who treated me the way they treated one another. My parents treated us all in the same sort of way. But my older brothers did go to law school, and they were miserable. They were just miserable. And I was an undergraduate at Stanford. One of my brothers was at both. The other one was at Stanford Law School. And they were just absolutely miserable, and I was having a great time. And I thought, well, I'm not sure I want to trade this for that. And but I graduated early. One of my brothers said, you should get a job now, so that when you graduate, you can just roll into that job full-time, do a part-time job now. I could still live and work in the dormitory where I was committed for the year. And he said, you should be a legal assistant. Try working for one of the big firms as a legal assistant. So I interviewed, and I happened to get a job as the legal assistant for Mary Cranston at Pillsbury, Madison, and Sutro then, who went on to become the chairman, first female chairman of that firm, I think of any major law firm. And at the time, she was a young partner. And she didn't like the model at Pillsbury where you had a pool of legal assistants and you grabbed one for one matter and one for another matter. She wanted her own legal assistant, and that was luckily me. And she was determined that I was going to go to law school. Once we got to know each other, once she saw what I was capable of, she was very quickly putting me in doing the kind of work that the first-year associates were doing, and then the second-year associates, and then checking their work and revising their work. And after 2 years, she said, Dorian, you really have to go to law school. And that's ultimately how I got there. I loved the work that I was doing. I loved working with this woman. I loved getting, the opportunity to try new and different things, and maybe have the chance to do that with other people. I did not have the terrible experience that my brothers had in law school, and it was a great decision.
My turn? Yes. My father's from Arkansas. I didn't realize we had that in common. My dad was not a lawyer. He was a Navy pilot. He grew up in abject poverty in Arkansas and was rescued by an ROTC scholarship at UCLA, and was the most patriotic person I've ever met. He was incredibly grateful to this country and the Navy for rescuing him from poverty, and he wanted me to be a Navy pilot. So he took me to UCLA when I was in high school and had me go on a tour with all the ROTC people. And after changing schools every single year of my life and going to 3 high schools, I completely rejected that. And I went to college. And we didn't have very much money. After I started at Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher as a first-year associate, I made more money than my father, who'd been in the Navy at that point 28 years. So we didn't have any money. I had a million jobs. One of my jobs was working for a lawyer, a criminal defense lawyer in San Diego, as his gopher. He was in court all the time. I would bring him coffee. I would make copies for him. Anything he needed. I was in and out of the courtroom all the time. And there was a time that he was trying a case with a co-defendant, and that co-defendant was represented by a woman named Elizabeth Semmel, who I now realize how young she was. So she was in her sort of late-ish 20s. She must have been about 28. She was amazing. She had this courtroom presence. She was really tiny, this little blonde bob. My hair is just like hers now. Maybe that's a little creepy. But I watched her every day for about 3 weeks. I never met her. I never spoke with her. I never introduced myself. I just watched her, and I decided that's what I want to do. It's incredible what she's doing. She was a criminal defense lawyer. She was a trial lawyer. She was amazing. I met her about 23 or 4 years later when she started. She still runs the death penalty clinic at the law school at Berkeley, and I went to an alumni lunch, and she was speaking. And I went up and introduced myself to her, and I said to her, you know how when people always ask you why you went to law school? And she said, yeah, and I said, this is the story that I tell. And she started to cry. But that's why I went to law school.
That's great. Now, did we finish? Did you?
I didn't go.
Oh, good.
I did not go. Here I am. Well, I'm going to start with a reverse story, which is I was in this courtroom with my granddaughter, Celeste, who was 5, and I put her up, and I spent the day with her because it was right after her 5th birthday, and she told me several times that day that she wanted to be an artist and a mommy when she grew up. So not with any ulterior motive in mind, but I took her to the courthouse, and then I took her to this very courtroom, and I put her up on the bench, and I argued a case to her. So I stood over there, and she was on the bench being a judge, and it was a rather simple case of good people and bad people. And then afterwards she said, I think I'll be an artist and a mommy and a lawyer. So, but I guess I was a reluctant lawyer. When I was in 8th grade, first of all, it's interesting to hear all of these women talk about what aspirations their families had for them, because I think what we all have in common was families who had no idea that women were supposed to not do important things and things that they cared about, whatever they wanted. And I also grew up that way. Just nobody ever told me I couldn't do whatever I thought I wanted to do. My 7th grade teacher told me I should be a doctor, and when I was in 8th grade, I had to write an essay about what I wanted to do when I grew up, and I had no idea. So my mother said, well, write that you want to be a lawyer, because law is a very good career for a woman. And the reason why law was a good career for a woman is because you can do legal aid work, i.e. you don't have to earn a living, so you can do legal aid work, and I think she had a friend whose sister was a lawyer and did legal aid work. I wrote the essay, although I didn't really want to be a lawyer, and I didn't want to be a lawyer for all the way through college. A year after college, I married my husband, Stephen Berzon, who was a lawyer, or was going to law school at the time, and I therefore spent a lot of time around lawyers after that. We eventually moved here because he was doing legal aid work, and lived on College and Stewart in Berkeley, and I spent a year trying to find a job as a writer or an editor, and I did some writing for the Bay Guardian. But I never actually found a job, so I figured I did have some interesting jobs before that, but this was a hard place to come up with something, and I therefore figured that there's a law school down the block, literally down the block. So I will apply to law school and go to law school, really by default. I remember I wrote in my essay that I really wanted to be a journalist and write about law, but I did end up going to law school. And I actually thought that my education at Bolt Hall, which we called it then, was far superior to what I'd gotten as an undergraduate at Harvard. And I got drawn in. I mean, the first day I started law school, I also went over to the psychology department to see if maybe I wanted to be a graduate student in psychology. Not that I'd ever had done anything in psychology. And I had a conversation with them, and it was clear it would be very complicated to work my way into that. But more than that, I really wanted to know how contracts came out. It was really kind of interesting. So I hung in there and met some wonderful people, and including, there were 2 women professors at the law school at the time. One of whom was Herma Kay, who was the mentor to all of us. And then when I finished, or was about to finish, I applied for clerkships. And I interviewed with 4 or 5, I was going to stay here in the Bay Area, and I interviewed with 4 or 5 judges, all but one of whom had a reputation of never hiring a woman. I was interviewed by all of them and not hired, except by the one who didn't have that reputation, who was Judge Browning, in this very courthouse. The courthouse is now named for him. And he always used to say, after I came on the bench and he was still here, and he'd give me advice about how to hire law clerks, and he'd say, there's no reason to interview anybody. And I'd say, but you interviewed me, which he did. And the only thing I was able to figure out, because I left out a part of the story, which is that I had a son after my 2nd year of law school, which was a little bit odd at the time. And I think he wanted to see to make sure that I wasn't completely crazy. But he hired me, and I came to this building every day, which, as challenging as the neighborhood is now, it was a lot more challenging in those days. And I guess we will speak later about our later career, but I was then, in a story that I will tell, became Justice Brennan's first woman law clerk, and then started doing work for the labor movement as the first woman representing the AFL-CIO. So I guess those are the two firsts. And then came back here and helped to found my husband's dream, which was a small law firm, Marsha Berzon, which had its 40th anniversary party 2 weeks ago, which was very exciting. And here I am, on the bench since 2000.
Great story, great. So, well, now, if you, what did you find the most difficult about being the first woman, and what was the best part of it? And the most difficult part of it was that you were noticed all the time. And people actually had the unmitigated gall regularly to say to you, how does it feel to get a job because you're a woman? And, you know, you summon up all these ideas about how good you were in the grade that you got in torts and things, but know that they'll always believe that it was affirmative action that got you the job. So that was the most difficult part. But the best part was always being noticed. Nobody could overlook you. There weren't a whole lot of other women around. And it's good. It's good if every time you say it's to your advantage and your client's advantage, if people listen every time you say something, or whenever you say something. And so I must say that right from the beginning, I enjoyed it, and I had two first jobs. One was the first woman in the job. One was running the public defender in the District of Columbia, and the other was being a professor at Stanford. And those jobs were both extremely intriguing, and they both had lots of good and bad parts about them, so I'll tell you more later.
No, just keep on. You're wonderful. We want to hear more. Well, my first, I guess, was actually my last job, but I'll go back to law school a little bit, because I started law school when I was 20 years old. I didn't know beans about anything. And I went to Albany Law School, which is in upstate New York, Albany, New York. It was quite intimidating, because there were like 3 other women in the class, and one of whom I'll tell you about, because I admired her from that moment on and what happened. But all the rest of them were men, and I didn't know. I had no life experience at all. I'd only did waitressing kinds of jobs before and so forth. So it was quite a challenge. Ultimately, I transferred from Albany because I needed to work. I didn't have money, and I transferred to Fordham and went to law school at night, Fordham University in New York City. But one of the first days in class in criminal law, which was taught by the dean of the law school, I think there were 4 women in that class. One of them was a second-year student who, for some reason, was taking criminal law for the first time. But those are those sort of graduated, rooms where, everybody looks down. And of course, at that time, if you were called on and you had to stand and respond. So the dean called on this woman who was a second year. She was quite statuesque, very attractive, and the guys always drooled all over her. So some of us were not noticed, and that was probably just as well, as far as I was concerned. So the first question the dean asks her, well, Miss Bress, her last name was B-R-E-S-S, well, Miss Bress, why are you here? To get a man? Oh, my God. Ellie stood there with all the poise that you could imagine, turned around and very slowly looked up and down every row and said with the greatest disdain, hardly. And I thought, 20 years old, and I'm sitting there, and I'm thinking, can I do that if my time comes? You know, but, and then when I transferred to Fordham, there was one woman in my law school class and myself, and we were in law school at night, and we had one professor who we found out, after raising our hands a lot of times to answer a question or ask a question or whatever, that he had ladies' night. And there was one evening of the month or year, whatever, semester, that he would call on the two of us, and only us. And the rest of the time, you could raise your hand, you could, you know, try to chime in or something, totally ignored. It's as if we were invisible. So those were the experiences of those early days. When I started law school in 1963, so, you know, it was 1963 and 64 that was occurring. So the two of us graduated. We, at the time of graduation, were the only two women in our law school class as well. In terms of being first, was not first, you know, I practiced with another woman in when I came to San Francisco, and I'd practiced for a little while in New York as well as a law firm, but I then went on the state court bench. I was not the first woman on the state court bench. On my particular bench, there were two other women there already. They were great mentors and a great help to me. I did spend the first 9 months of my first year on the bench pregnant. Which was interesting because that was the first time that any judge on the California courts, in the California court system, had been pregnant. They didn't know what to do. They didn't have maternity leave. And I had been appointed partly because, as it was referred to, more bang for the buck, because I'd been very active in the women's movement. So they thought that somehow that gave them extra points, I guess, in appointing me. So I could not take off a significant amount of time. I took 10 days off. And I think some of them, I was still pregnant at the beginning of the 10 days, and I was wondering if I was going to be going back, you know, still pregnant. But finally the dear child came. But that was it. I took 10 days because I said, you know, given the brouhaha or hoopla or whatever you want to call it, that accompanied my being appointed in the first place, I thought that I didn't want anyone to think we could possibly take advantage of the situation. Now things are better, but that was an experience. And then I became the first woman on the U.S. District Court, where I was appointed in 1980, and served there for 32 years. And I could tell you lots of stories about that, but I think we should hear from Dorian and her first and so forth. Enough about me.
Well, things had changed a fair amount when I was in law school. Some of these experiences that Judge Patel and Professor Babcock have spoken of, I didn't really have. And when I was asked to talk about the first, you know, my most significant first, I thought, I don't think I have a first. And then it occurred to me, oh yeah, I am the first female general counsel of Oracle. So I guess that is my first. And before that, I was the head of the litigation team for a number of years. I've been the general counsel for 10 years now. I've been at Oracle for 26 years, so for quite some time. And I can't say that there was anything that was particularly difficult about being first. And that's in part because of the way that I came to the role, which is over time building credibility, establishing relationships, doing a lot of things at the company that brought some attention to me and to my capabilities and my leadership. There were, however, certainly annoying situations, frustrating situations that I came into, and it was usually involved an older man, a partner at a law firm, who had a really difficult time taking instruction from a younger female. And I'll tell you one story that really sticks out in my mind. It had to do with a very significant matter, game-changing for our organization. And we were having to present to the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. Very hostile Department of Justice at the time to the thing that we wanted to do. It was an acquisition. And we were in a room with classic D.C. meeting, 30 people, associates lined up against the walls. And I had said to the lead partner, I really want you to talk about the litigation risk to the Department of Justice. The government has to understand it has a huge litigation risk here, and we're willing to litigate with the government. We'll do that. Don't worry, we'll do that. So we went through the slides. We got to the slides on litigation risk, and he says, well, we know that if you block, there could be litigation, and you know the risks. So, and then he moved on through the deck. And the president of the company, who's now the CEO of the company, is sitting much further up towards the middle of the table, and she does this. The moment this guy says it, she does this, and she looks down at me like, you've got to do something. And so I launched into this full argument about how they face great risk in moving forward with this particular case, which by the way, I was right, because we actually did win that trial, and went through it. The then head of the antitrust division, he sort of nodded his head, and he said, "Okay, yeah, I'd point out the risks too. I'd point out the risks too. Fine." And when we got done with that meeting, and we went to sort of debrief with the team, this senior partner came to me, and he put his hand out to shake my hand, and he said, "You did well." I said, "Well, okay, thank you." And he said, "The best part was, you got it right." And I thought, I can't believe you just told me that. I'm paying your bills. So, he wasn't on the case the following day. I switched counsel. I needed somebody who was going to be a team player who could sort of get over the fact that I was younger and I was female. But, he had to realize that there was a reason that I was in the chair that I was in. All of us, when we get to these positions, there's a reason that we're there. We've done something in our careers to get us to that particular position. The best thing about all of it, the best thing about the position that I'm in now, really, is the support. It's having, pioneers like those that are here on the bench with me who've gone before us, who've really paved the way, and having now other women general counsel who are also litigators, not from a corporate background, but from a litigation background, as well as my team, which is 50%, over 50% women in the legal department, and the legal managers, 48% women. But having that kind of support, that is what is really, really gratifying.
So I will tell my first clerk for Justice Brennan's story in a moment, which is both, I think, what was good about being first and what was bad about being first. But I wanted to say first that before that, in this courthouse, when I was a law clerk, as I said, to Judge Browning, and there was one other woman clerk at the time in the building, Stephanie Wildman, later a professor at Santa Clara, and before that at USF. And we always remain very close friends to this day, and we always remark on the fact that people always mixed us up. We were both sort of tallish and sort of darkish, but other than that, don't necessarily resemble each other at all. And nonetheless, people, the other clerks and staff people invariably confused us. So, when I began clerking for Judge Browning, I got a call from one of the professors at what we then called Boalt Hall, as I said, because there were several former Brennan clerks teaching at Boalt, and they had an arrangement with Justice Brennan that every several years he would allow them to choose a law clerk for him. And a few years before, they had chosen Allison Gray, Tom Gray, who was here, his sister, and Justice Brennan refused to hire her because she was a woman, explicitly for that reason. So they decided they were going to try again, and they called and said, would I be interested? And I said yes. I actually had been asked the year before about whether I would be interested in clerking for Justice Douglas, who had several women clerks, but not in a happy situation from what I had heard. And I said no. As I said, I had a small child, and from what I understood about that clerkship, it wasn't going to be an enjoyable experience. But I did say I would be interested in clerking for Justice Brennan. So in that was probably in October, because in those days we hired just the year before. And in December, I got a call from Steve Barnett, who was the professor who was doing this, to say that I had not been hired. He didn't say who had been hired, and I didn't have the wherewithal to ask. So, as far as I knew, I wasn't hired. That winter or early spring, Nina Totenberg wrote an article in a now-defunct magazine, which was called The Last Plantation, and it told stories about the Supreme Court, including how they had African-American messengers who were basically messengers, ran things back and forth, and every one of them was African-American, and also how Justice Brennan would not hire a woman clerk. And I've never known whether that had anything to do with what happened next, but what happened next was that I got a call, Judge Browning came in and said, I've just talked to Justice Brennan and I think you'll be hearing from him. This was probably March. And the next day he calls me and offers me the job. And at that point, and Steve Barnett came over for dinner to give me advice about the clerkship. The main one was to be nice to the secretary, Mary, who Justice Brennan, some years later, married after his wife died. But I never did know what the story behind the whole thing was. And then in the nice part of being first, in some ways nice, was that Justice Brennan was lovely to me, and not only that, but he had a granddaughter who that year was in Washington with her mother, who was a single mother and had to be picked up at a daycare center, so we left at the same time to pick up our children at the daycare center. And as far as I could tell, there was no particular issue. But years later, when Justice Brennan died, and I went to the funeral, and the same Professor Barnett was there, and I said, Steve, you never told me what happened. Why did you call me and tell me that I didn't get the job, and then several months later, I did get the job? And he sort of turned colors and didn't answer me. And the next day, when I get home, I get a call from him saying, well, I think I can tell you now. Why don't we have coffee? So we go have coffee, and he tells me the following story, which is in the biography of Justice Brennan, so I'm not telling tales out of school, although I have a slightly different version from Professor. No, only a little bit different. But what he told me, as I recall, was that indeed Justice Brennan had flatly turned me down because he didn't want to have a woman law clerk. And the interesting thing about this, to me, is this was after the Frontiero opinion. The Frontiero opinion was the one where Justice Brennan argued strenuously, but he only got 4 votes, that sex should be a suspect classification. He wrote or somebody on his behalf wrote the famous line about how putting women on pedestals was really equivalent to putting them in cages. And despite that public stance, he specifically refused to hire me, apparently. And then Steve Barnett, was now deceased, was the hero of this story because he either wrote him a letter, which is what the book says, or he went to see him, which is what I think he told me, and essentially said to him, this is not consistent with your ideals. You wouldn't like if someone did this to your daughter. Besides which, someday somebody's going to sue you, and I would be a witness. And according to the book, at least, Justice Brennan said, Steve, you're a very good lawyer. You'll probably win all your cases. You're right. And he hired me. And I'm always, when I tell this story, very forgiving in the sense that I think people are the product of their upbringing, and it's easier to pronounce a principle, as he did in Frontiero, than to translate it into your own life. But it seems to me that the strong people are the ones who do eventually and see when they've made a mistake, as he did. Now, there was still hangover, and the only reasons I ever heard about why he wouldn't hire a woman are A, Mary didn't like it. I wouldn't like it. She didn't want to have another woman around. And B, he liked to curse in front of his clerks, and he couldn't curse in front of a woman. And he did definitely have this leftover sort of debonair thing. So, for example, whenever I would go to law clerk reunions, I had to be escorted in by him and sit next to him, and when I was the only woman in the room, which I was for quite a while. He did hire several other women law clerks, but not a lot. And I think I will stop there, and maybe somewhere down the line I'll tell the story about being the first woman representing the National Labor Movement.
Like Dorian, I am a sort of a half generation behind these incredible role models for me. I started law school in 1984, and I think things had started to change. My class was half women at that point in time, and it was more subtle than I think some of the things that you all heard half a beat ahead of us. But certainly there were things happen, and as Dorian characterized it, it was more annoying than anything else. I remember things like I had a case when I was a young prosecutor against the Hells Angels, and I was assigned to the case, and it was very successfully concluded. We had a trial. 3-week trial. They were all convicted, dealt with a lot of sort of safety issues throughout the trial, and it was only after the trial that the agents told me that they were absolutely horrified when they found out that I'd been assigned to the case because I was 27 or 28 years old, and they didn't think I was tough enough to handle it. They were offering this as a compliment. And I'm glad that I showed them throughout the case that I could handle it and I was tough enough. But it was just sort of funny to hear that was their initial impression of me and the case. I had another trial, and again, this is just in the category of annoying. I had another trial where the jury afterwards told me that they all had decided during deliberations that my father must have been a lawyer. And I took it as a compliment. They must have thought I did a nice job, but they assumed that I did a nice job because my father had been a lawyer. So it's just sort of that kind of category, the things you notice them and you take note of them and tuck them away, and just prove to people that whatever preconceptions they might have about you were incorrect. The other thing, fast forward a little bit, is when I was pregnant with my now 20-year-old twin sons, people repeatedly asked me if I was planning to not work after I had them. And I was planning to work, and I took 9 months off. I did not take 10 days off, like Judge Patel. I took 9 months off. I decided I deserved as much time off as I was pregnant with twins. But no one asked my husband. Not one person asked my husband if he was planning to stop working. And I thought after the physical part of carrying these children and giving birth to them, we were in the same situation. No one ever asked him that. So, I've sort of dealt with things like that throughout. But then fast forward when I became what people thought was the first female U.S. attorney here, and I'm going to tell just a little story about the actual first U.S. attorney here. But people thought I was the first U.S. attorney here until we did some research and found out that there was a woman who'd been a little bit lost to the sands of time. But fast forward to being the U.S. attorney in 2010 and being in a man's world. I mean, this is I was thrust into law enforcement, as I had been in law enforcement as an assistant U.S. attorney twice before, but now the U.S. attorney is considered the top federal law enforcement official in the jurisdiction. And so now I'm the top federal law enforcement official, and almost all of the other people in those positions in all the agencies were men. There were a couple of women along the way, but most of them were men. And every meeting I had with the federal law enforcement family, I led the meeting because I was the top federal law enforcement official. So they always came to me. I had my seat at the table. I was always at the head of the conference table. They would all sit around. The protocol is they would all arrive and assemble and be seated, and then my secretary would come and get me, and I'd be brought in the room. I mean, there's a little bit of ceremony, even just about a meeting. But these men who'd been in law enforcement their entire careers did not skip a beat. I felt nothing but incredible respect from all of them. So fast forward from those days where people are doubting my ability to handle a case that involved the Hells Angels, and now I'm sitting at the head of the table. In that span of time, it felt completely different and evolved to me. So, I think I'm lucky to have come in, slightly later and when things had changed. But let me just tell you just a quick story about the actual first female U.S. attorney, because people thought I was getting called, when I was nominated, I was getting calls from the press about the fact that I was the first woman. And I said, I don't know that I'm the first woman. We probably should look into that. And I looked into it, and then once I became the U.S. attorney, our librarian did a tremendous amount of research and dug up a lot of information about her. But her name was Annette Adams. She went to Bolt. She graduated in 1912. There were a couple of other women in her class. I've seen a class photograph, and it looks like there may be 2 or 3 women total. She wanted to work with other lawyers, but she couldn't get a job working with any other lawyers, so she hung a shingle. She handled criminal defense cases. She tried a case against the then U.S. attorney, a guy named John Preston, who had a total of 4 assistant U.S. attorneys. And when one of his assistant U.S. attorneys stepped down, he hired her as he offered her a job as the first female assistant U.S. attorney in the country in 1913. The Attorney General of the United States, Mick Reynolds, was apparently an awful guy. When you read his, I read in connection with all the research we did, I read his obituary, and it's actually very sad. The obituary talks about the fact that he has no friends, and everybody hated him, which is sad. So I don't mean to celebrate that, but he blocked her appointment as an assistant U.S. attorney. He did not want her to be the first female assistant U.S. attorney. And Woodrow Wilson was the president, and he didn't like Mick Reynolds either, so he moved into the Supreme Court to get rid of him.
Where he was awful.
As the AG, where he apparently was awful and had no friends. But once he was moved from his position as AG to the Supreme Court, the next AG immediately appointed her as the first assistant U.S. attorney. Then John Preston was appointed to a position in Washington, and he recommended her as the United States attorney here in San Francisco, and she was nominated by Woodrow Wilson and confirmed as the U.S. attorney here. She then went on to a position at the Department of Justice as AAG, which it's reorganized a little bit since then, but it looks like she was third in command of the Department of Justice in 1918. And I'll just read you just a sentence or two from the New York Times article when she was appointed to that position in Washington in 1918. The New York Times wrote, "Her opponents predicted that no woman could handle cases of the sort that are dealt with in the United States Attorney's Office in San Francisco, as they have to deal with the selling of liquor to the Indians, the violations of the Asiatic exclusion law, smuggling, and the like. But Dr. Adams speedily confounded predictions, for she handled many of the hardest cases, and her abilities soon became recognized beyond the bounds of the state." So in 1918, the first United States attorney in the country, female United States attorney in the country, Annette Adams, was here in San Francisco. Her office was in this building, and I was honored to be taken to see it, and it's still here, and I have a picture of her in it. If you ever go to the U.S. Attorney's Office here in San Francisco, we had it blown up. It's in the lobby of the U.S. Attorney's Office. It's this big. She's sitting at her desk. She looks incredibly modern. There's just a modern feel about her, but she has a Victorian sort of blouse with lace up around her neck. She has glasses on a chain around her neck. She has a legal pad. They look exactly the same today, and a pen. And what I love about her is she looks incredibly competent, and she must have been. Her hair is an absolute mess. So she didn't have time to deal with her hair. But she was the U.S. attorney and the first female.
Well, one of the things that I want to encourage women generally, but particularly the vanishing breed of first women to do, is to write a biography, because these stories are going to disappear, and they're not and they're not stories that are going to be repeated, as you can tell from the bits of them that you've heard here. And I've been reading women's biographies. That's one of the things I've been doing in the last couple of months, and it's just kind of fascinating, all the things there are about, and difficulties and trials there are in being a lawyer, any kind of lawyer, and then add to that facing discrimination, sex discrimination, and it makes a fascinating story. But so one of the questions that I put here, because I wanted to tell you this story, was I've written my biography. I'm sure it's on Amazon or at the nearest bookstore, which is Fish Raincoats, I've called it. And it is a story, and I thought I would sort of end. I think this is my best story, and I've told it many times. It's not a story of practice, but it's a story that you can see who I am. And so that I would love it if some of the other panelists would tell their best stories. And then we'll have some questions and answers if you want to have, if you all want to ask some. But I was telling a story about when I was young. When I was, I think I was 10 or 11. I was a precocious 10-year-old, it says here. So, and I did a lot of reading, and I was asked to be on a quiz show. That this was before television, you understand, so that this was a quiz show that was on the radio, and it was the 4th, 5th, and 6th grade of each of 2 schools, and the participants were sitting on each side, and in the middle there was a movie projector and a screen and a recorder. There were all kinds of just wonderful prizes that any school would want that we could win. And sitting beside me, representing the 10th grade, was my classmate, Billy Davis. And so people were asking us, like, how did you all get to do this? And everybody was kind of jealous, you know, just get to be up on this big stage and win the prizes for the school. And I just, not knowing any better, I just said, well, I have the highest IQ in the 10th grade, and Billy Davis, he has the second highest. So the first question, I'm called to the microphone, which seems like 1,000 miles away from my seat, and I'm asked, where is the Sahara Desert? I do not have the faintest notion where the Sahara Desert is. I've heard of the Sahara Desert, but not where it is, no. And the moderator said, it begins with an A. And I said, Asia? No, honk. And I sat down, and Billy Davis leaned forward, and he says, I knew that. Then I heard the 5th and 6th graders just rattling off answers to much harder questions. And my second question was, who was the famous French scientist, who invented a process for purifying milk? Who knows? And so the moderator says, well, think about the milk carton. And I said, homogene? Again, bulk. And I sit down, and Billy Davis said, I knew that. And then, but at least this time I got a big laugh. Then I went up for the 3rd time, and the question was, what did the Native Americans use fish for other than food? Again, I haven't the faintest notion, but it's in all the 4th grade books. It's still there. I saw it the other day, but I didn't know. And I said, raincoats? And again, there was a huge laugh. And but shame overcame me, and I felt afterwards a 4th grade teacher took me out in the hall, and she said, listen, Barbara, it wouldn't be so bad that we lost the movie projector and the screen and all of these things and lost the whole thing, but the bad part was you telling everybody that you were the smartest person in the class, especially the way it turned out. And so I was so ashamed that I stopped going to school altogether, and I would just pretend to leave and climb up in the magnolia tree in our backyard and read until it was time to come home. So that was, I don't know how I ever got back to school. I think my mother must have had something to do with it and had some words with them. But eventually I got back to school. So I've told this story many times. As at first I told it just to shrinks and but then when I came to Stanford, which is so far from my roots, I thought the students would enjoy it. They were all so frightened about whether they were smart enough, and here I am. I'm a law professor, and this is how smart I was, so that all my colleagues and students have heard the story many times. And so my colleague, Pam Carlin, one day was arguing a case before the United States Supreme Court, and she went over to the Smithsonian's Native American Art Museum and found on display a circa 1910 Yupik coat called a quaperic, officially translated as fish raincoat. Pam fired off an email to me. So, Barbara, nearly 60 years after your school was wrongfully denied its movie projector, you have been vindicated. You were right. Indians did use fish for raincoats. That annoying little Billy was wrong. Once I'm recovered from post-argument exhaustion, I shall be hard on the trail of figuring out how the contribution of Louis Laham Ajané to modern chemistry. This should give you a great new ending to the story.
Am I supposed to say something now? I was never so precocious. I don't remember being that funny when I was little or serious or whatever. If we're talking about, I don't know, interesting stories, first stories, whatever. First of all, I was very involved in the women's movement, particularly when I came to California and got involved and was legal counsel or general counsel for the National Organization for Women. So I had a certain sense of presence about how women should be treated. When I took the bar in California, I'd taken the bar in New York, but of course that didn't do me any good here. And so I took the bar here, and one of the first cases, I'm going to tell you about first cases. And one of the first cases I had was an appeal to the Ninth Circuit involving a sex discrimination case. It involved a woman who had been denied pursuing anything beyond police matron, i.e. applying to be sergeant of a police department. And the whole story in and of itself was interesting. So I went to the Ninth Circuit, my first appeal before any, Court of Appeals, including the Ninth Circuit, and there were three elderly gentlemen, I won't repeat their names now, were seated behind the bench. One of them had, the case just before mine was a securities case. Didn't seem to be much interested because he seemed to be asleep most of the time. And I thought, well, that's good. But I guess somebody mentioned the word sex or whatever, and all of a sudden, when I got up to argue, he was wide awake. And one of his first questions to me was, now that would give it away if I did the accent, right? and the halting words. This client of yours, is she this is the first question I get. Is she a Miss or a Mrs.? And I really want my client to win this case. So I don't want to screw this up, right? So I said something like, well, Your Honor, I'm not sure quite if I understand the relevancy of the question, but if you want me to answer it, she's a Ms. And, well, I never liked this Ms. business, et cetera. And I had lost in the district court. Ultimately, they reversed the district court, and I went back to the district court. And I'd had that judge reversed actually a couple of times. When I argued cases for the Immigration Service, I'd had him reversed. To get to the maybe another interesting fact of all of this is when my name was in for the district court, trying to think how this, oh, I know. Well, I got a couple of interesting calls from a judge at the district court, sort of encouraging me and so on and so forth. But what happened was that when they notified me that I was being appointed, and they told me the seat to which I was being appointed, it was the seat of the judge I'd had reversed several times. But he was very pleasant about it and so on and so forth, no problem. But my first argument first trial in California in a state court, again, the brazen hussy, right? It was I don't even remember what the case was. It may have been a discrimination case. But opening statements, I made my opening statement, came back, went to sit down, and you can imagine as a rabid feminist, you know, how I felt about this. I noticed opposing counsel was an older gentleman, came over and helped me with my chair. I found that totally humiliating. So I looked at the jury and I thought, okay, I mean, how did they react to that? And they seemed to be sort of a little surprised. They looked at me like they were a little bit surprised, maybe. So I thought, can I get away with this? So when he finished his opening statement, I went over and helped him with his chair. And most of the jurors laughed, I could tell, you know. And then I will fast forward to the last story, which you were talking about, the U.S. Attorney's Office. So it's my first motion to suppress on the district court. And and I granted the motion to suppress, and I thought, of course, you know, she's this Democrat from Alameda County and whatever else, you know. So they made a motion for reconsideration. And an attorney that I'm sure you knew very well, he was head of the appellate division, I think, they came in, and to explain the motion for reconsideration, he said, well, we want you we want to help you protect your record. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, do they do this with all the new judges to test them out, you know? Or is he doing with this because I'm a woman? And actually the attorney representing the defendant in that case was a woman also. And I just looked down at him and I said, I consider that very patronizing. I'll tell you what, I'll look out for my record, you look out for yours. I was affirmed, and I hate to say it, but one day I saw him after that. I said, not a bad record, huh?
I know who you're talking about.
You know who I'm talking about. He did apologize later on, and he's really a nice guy, but you just don't know in that situation whether it's because you're new, you're a neophyte, and you know that they always test out the new judges, or is it because you're a woman? But I just didn't take any chances. So I think, and also once you put your foot down, and also something else that we must never forget is things work much better if you have a sense of humor. And there are lots of things you can say if you say it with the right lilt in your voice, whatever, but don't let it go unless it really deserves to be let go. If you really need to say something, then say it with a bit of a whatever. That indicates that you do have a sense of humor, but this just doesn't work. And I'm sure you've got a gazillion stories about those kind of people.
This is very tough to follow. Well, I'll tell you just a little bit about as I was growing up, and then a story when I was in my early days of being the general counsel at Oracle, and how they kind of pair up. One maybe foreshadows the other. When I was quite young, as I mentioned, I had two older brothers. They thought that they had another little brother. That was me. It just meant that they didn't treat me any differently than they treated one another. Interestingly, my twin sister, they treated differently because she was not so, I was very rough and tumble. I was a real rough and tumble kind of kid, and I was always, climbing trees and jumping over fences and riding the bike through ditches and doing some things that might have been a little reckless. And my brothers probably liked that. They thought that was fun. And we would roughhouse quite a bit. We would have these now this will make me sound really stupid, we would have these gladiator fights in the backyard. This big backyard, big lawn, and all the kids would come over. One of my older brothers was like the Pied Piper of the neighborhood. Kids would come over, and we would take newspapers and we would roll them up and tape them, and we'd have these gladiator fights. And you always wanted to get into the final with my brother Derek, because Derek was the chief gladiator. He was the guy to beat. And then he took to, without any of us knowing, he took to actually putting a stick inside his rolled up newspaper. And he didn't hurt anybody, but all of our little newspapers would just like fall apart after they would just sort of fall, and his would still be pristine. And sort of ultimately came to figure that out and sort of take it to him. But I wouldn't shy away from the battle, wouldn't shy away from the fight. I would stay in it. We would have these long, arduous games throughout the entire neighborhood. It would go on into the night. I was always there, sticking with it. I fast forward to my very first board meeting at Oracle, and I had. Up to that point, I'd known a lot of the people within the finance organization. Obviously, I worked really closely with them. And there was a particular person within the organization that they weren't very happy with, who was being considered for a promotion. And nobody wanted to go to our boss and say, look, this isn't going to work out. This will not be a good situation. Please don't do it. But they would do what my twin sister used to do all the time. They'd say, you go talk to her. You go do it. So I did, and I said, look, this is what the problem is. You're going to have people who are going to be very, very upset. It's not going to function well. It functions really well now, the way we're organized, and just was very, very frank about it. And it was about the next week that I went into my very first board meeting. I knew most of the board members quite well because of litigation matters that I had to report on in advance. I made sure I'd gone out and met the other ones before my first board meeting. And we get through, what I think is, most of the agenda. And then the then CEO, Larry, is talking about, this particular person. Really smart, would do a fantastic job, a terrific experience, but I don't know, some people seem to have an issue. Somebody's been talking to Safra, I don't know who's talking to Safra, just kind of going on and on about it. And I'm thinking, all right, that's me. That would be me. And this train is starting to go down this track, and it was a very bad track for it to go down. So I said, well, that was me, and here's what I said. Here's what I reported on, and I just lay it out. And as I'm looking around at the boardroom, the board members are all sitting there like this. And I think they cannot believe that I'm doing my first board meeting that I'm actually doing this, contradicting what the CEO, clearly a path that he wants to go down, contradicting that. The very first go out as the board secretary and general counsel, and sort of get through with my presentation, and Larry says, "Oh, well, that makes a difference. I guess we won't do that." And so I'm feeling really good about myself. I'm thinking, okay, good, that's great, terrific. Go out. One of the board members comes out, one of the heads of the committee, puts his arm around me, and says, wow, that was great. That was amazing. We are so incredibly proud of you. That took courage. But I'm thinking, wow, did nobody have that kind of courage in these board meetings beforehand? Was this never done? But I'm still feeling pretty good. And then he said, but you just need to know that you were in executive session. You weren't supposed to be there. So I went from, here to, and I thought, well, okay. But what it taught me is that sometimes you do, in a very, very uncomfortable situation, you have to stick with it. You've got to stick with your conviction. You've got to see it through, and it can be very, very uncomfortable. It's like getting batted about the head with a newspaper with a stick in it. But stick with it. At the end of the day, you've got to do the right thing. And at the end, with that comment, I could laugh at it. I was in executive session. I wasn't supposed to be there. I'm glad I was. But it made me think about something that my father used to always say, was just to, you got to have, no matter what you're doing, no matter how great your day, however big your victory is, you have to have a little humility, because there are going to be these little things along the way. It's what makes you human.
So, first of all, hearing all these, as I said before, I saw one unifying theme. Another one among these women is forthrightness. I think that, at least when I was growing up, there was a socialization of women to not be forthright. And the main thing I learned from my mother, well, two things. One, it was, don't run out of chicken. The worst thing that ever happened to her was she had a party and ran out of chicken. But the second was that she was a very forthright person and unusual for her time. And I used to be told, I remember when I was in 8th grade, one of my friends said to me, what the thing about you, Marsha, is when somebody asks you what they think of your new dress, you tell them. You're not supposed to, right? But to go more into what I said I would talk about a little, which was being a early woman lawyer for labor organizations. When I was in my Justice Brennan clerkship, a person who was doing Supreme Court work for the AFL-CIO in a small law firm in Washington was going to go in-house. He was a very, very good lawyer. The Supreme Court justices respected him a great deal, and I thought I could learn an enormous amount from him. And he came and asked whether I would take over his job at this small firm that was general counsel for the AFL-CIO. And so I did that for several years before we moved back here. And there were many interesting things about that, but one was really the mentorship and friendship of three women who were probably 15 to 20 years older than me. The first one got in touch with me soon after I came. Her name was Ruth Wyand. She was a fascinating woman, and I later gave a talk about her at the Yale Symposium on the 30th anniversary of the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, because I had a lot to do with the ultimate passage of the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. But when I first met Ruth, she came to talk to me about Gilbert versus General Electric, and she was the Associate General Counsel of the International Union of Electrical Workers, which was litigating this case, in which the Supreme Court later held that Title VII did not cover pregnancy discrimination, which led to the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. But Ruth told me this story over lunch, and I think this transmission of stories is really very important, because I've remembered this one forever. Ruth told me that she had been a lawyer for the NLRB in the National Labor Relations Board in the 40s and early 50s. And she had argued for the NLRB before the Supreme Court. She was one of the very first women, maybe the first, to argue before the Supreme Court in some very important NLRB cases. She then was fired she didn't tell me this, but I found it out later. She was fired by the NLRB because she was a white woman and she married an African-American man, and she was fired. And I traced this down later. I mean, I found the newspaper articles that reported on this. So she went to work for the labor movement, and she was the one really who dreamed up the idea that you could bring a case under Title VII and claim that giving unequal benefits or not, refusing to give disability benefits to women for pregnancy disabilities was a violation of Title VII. But what she told me in this conversation which began about the case, was she said, I'm so happy that there's finally a woman representing the AFL-CIO. She said, you know, I was offered your job some years ago by the man who was then the general counsel of the AFL-CIO. And he then, before I could start, he died. And the person who took over refused to honor the offer because he didn't want to have a woman lawyer. And so I didn't get to do it. And it really means a lot to me that someone is doing it now. So that was one story like that. And then there was another woman named Beatrice Rosenberg, who was about the same age. They were both about 70 in 1975. And Beatrice Rosenberg had been, I later learned, a high school classmate of Justice Brennan's. And she had been a lawyer in the criminal division of the Justice Department, and also one of the very first women representing the government. In that case, I think she also did Supreme Court work. And the interesting thing was they both ended up, as I recall, at the EEOC working on the regulations and guidelines for the Pregnancy Discrimination Act after it was passed. And they were, inspirations to me when I was beginning in a situation where when I went to meetings of union labor lawyers, and there were one or two women, and one of the main person other than Ruth Wyand, and then the third person I was going to mention was someone named Judith Fladdock, whose grandson was later my law clerk, and she used to introduce herself to me as the oldest living woman labor lawyer. But she later did a lot of pioneering work representing women professors, challenging tenure decisions. And in some ways, that's the generation of women, all who would probably be over 100 now, who were really the pioneers and whose stories I think really need to be told. And I was going to tell one other story. I had advocated for some time the notion that we should start having meetings of people representing lawyers representing unions. And so finally we had our first, what became the AFL-CIO Lawyers Coordinating Committee meeting in Montreal. Not Montreal, I'm sorry, in Minnesota, in Minneapolis. So we go to this session, and I spoke at it, and other people did, but someone got the idea that we should have a luncheon of the women who were representing, who were there, and I don't know, maybe there were 15 of us out of 150 or 200 people. And so we had lunch, and it was a kind of atrium kind of hotel, so you could see us. And J. Albert Wohl, who I always say was the only man in the world whose first name was Mr., was my boss in this little law firm. He was officially the general counsel of the AFL-CIO, although he didn't do much. Afterwards, Mr. Wohl said, "Oh, what was that luncheon? Were you having a fashion show?" And I said, "No, we weren't having a fashion show." And anyway, I think the transmission of stories is important, so I hope you all enjoyed ours today. So Barbara, should we, I don't know what time it is, it's probably time, I can't see the clock.
We got to start eating soon.
Yes.
Let's have one more story, then we'll start eating, or should we?
One last story would be fine.
Or should we have questions?
I don't think we have time for questions.
Okay.
I'm very hopeful that our panelists will stay with us for the reception and that you will all join us outside in the reception. I'm afraid that we probably need to let people go, but we'll be here for a bit for you to take a chance to speak with our panelists and also to join us out in the reception in the hallway. So thank you very much. I want to have you here. So fun. We're here on
We probably would have got some very interesting questions, but